course. Tonight's presentations are a milestone towards the completion of the Masters of Design degree at Stans. The MDes program emphasizes integrative design methods while focused on specific wicked problems. Tonight you'll learn about 4 very different thesis projects, but all are focused on making the world a more just place. The format is that each student will have 15 minutes to present their thesis work, followed by 10 minutes of discussion, and then we'll end the evening with food and more conversations. So our first presenter tonight is Kendell Miller-Roberts. Kendell earned her BFA in dance performance and a BA in human rights from Southern Methodist University. Before coming to Stans, she worked in human rights education. Her background in human rights and dance has forged a transformative viewpoint on the relationship between human dignity, design, and community engagement. She is excited about the possibilities of using design to further social justice. Welcome, Kendell.
Hello, everyone. For those of you who have not met me, my name is Kendell and my pronouns are she, her. And today I'll be talking to you about my thesis project, Designing for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion in Engineering Curricula. So before I talk about my project, I want to talk a little bit about myself, actually. So I was adopted from China when I was an infant, and I was raised by 2 moms, April and Darlene. And when I was a child, I often had to fill out school forms, and on these school forms, it would have a place for the mother's name and the father's name. But because I didn't have a father, I would often find myself just crossing it out and writing mom. And as I got older and started learning how to use computers, I realized that these computers and the spell check algorithm would not recognize the plural of moms and mothers. And so this algorithm, by not recognizing that one could have 2 moms or 2 mothers, or even 2 dads, shows that it wouldn't be able to recognize non-heteronormative family structures. And so this was really my first exposure to how the issues of DEI or DEI topics could cross over with engineering and design. So design shapes the world around us, and engineers in their own right are designers, right? They shape the built environment, from the roads that we drive on to the technology that we use, right? They really shape our environment from everything, right, from technology to roads. And now in the 21st century, it's incredibly pressing that these engineers and these designers are trained to understand topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Because when they don't, there are dire consequences, right? In facial recognition, there's racial bias. And in the 20th century, highways were used as a way to deepen racial segregation in residential neighborhoods. So if design shapes the world around us, how do we shape designers? How do we train them? How do we educate them? How do we educate future engineers and future designers to really be able to understand topics of diversity, equity, inclusion, topics of social justice, so they can create more equitable and inclusive design? So I was really intrigued by this, and I began thinking a little bit about, who is responsible for actually educating people, right? We can all agree that we should be able to uphold principles of diversity and equity and inclusion. But when it comes down to it, who actually is supposed to teach us about these things, right? How do we move into critical consciousness? And so if you zoom further in, what we think about, obviously we think, the classroom. The classroom is the place where teachers should be educating us on these topics. And so I took this and I came up with my research question. How do University of Michigan engineering faculty design DEI content for their undergraduate classes? And so I chose to situate my research within the University of Michigan at the College of Engineering to further investigate, how do faculty actually teach these topics to their students? How do they choose the topics? What methods are they using? And how can we better and more fully integrate DEI topics into course design? So for my thesis project and my design intervention, I've been prototyping a card deck specifically for engineering educators to use during their phase of course design. So the idea of this card deck is that it would link DEI topics, learning objectives, which is based on the taxonomy of significant learning, which I'll speak a little bit about later, and learning methods. So the ultimate goal of this card deck is to help educators think, how do I link all all of these three things, right? When I talk about things like race or identity, I'm not just talking about it randomly. I know exactly what I'm trying to get my students to learn and right, and how they'll be learning about these things. So this is an example of my first prototype of one of the cards. As you can see on one side, it has the name of a topic. And then on the back side, it has a short description of what it is, some examples, and then a prompting question for educators to think more deeply about how it relates to their course design. So some things to note about this card deck. So I've been thinking a little bit about how would educators actually use this card deck? And so there are a couple ideas. One is that the card deck could be used randomly. So educators could be handed a learning objective card, a DEI topics card, and a learning methods card, and think a little bit about how those three things would apply to their course design. Other ways that these card decks could be used are in a workshop or a small facilitated session with educators to help them when they're doing course design. And another way is to think about using these cards on visual mapping, which is what I did through my research. So through my research, I wanted to better understand the firsthand experience of engineering educators to further develop this prototype to help educators more fully integrate these topics into their course design. So a little bit about my design process. I first began in the review stage, in which I did secondary research, and I did a literature review from the fields of engineering education, and design. Then I moved into my gather stage, which consisted of primary research. I conducted a survey with 9 participants from the College of Engineering faculty. And then I also conducted 8 semi-structured interviews virtually because of COVID. We also used a virtual tool called Mural, which is a virtual collaboration tool that functions kind of as like a whiteboard. And then next I moved into my analysis stage, in which I examined all of my data for key insights and themes about their experiences and data that could help inform the next stage, which is prototyping, which would inform the second iteration of my prototype of the card deck. So next I want to speak a little bit about the context of my work. So the College of Engineering is incredibly large. There's 10,000 plus students and there's over 600 faculty within the College of Engineering. And within the College of Engineering, my research was able to span 9 of those departments, everything from biomedical engineering to computer science to chemical engineering and mechanical engineering, just to name a few. So a little bit about my sample. So most of the people who participated in my project were lecturers in the College of Engineering. Also, most of them identified as white and a few identified as people of color. And my participants were almost evenly split by gender, and one participant chose not to disclose their gender. So next, I want to talk a little bit about what I think most excites me, which is the actual results from my work. So 2 really important statistics to note from the survey specifically are that 50% of participants felt that DEI content is always needed in their classes, versus 37.5% of participants actually always or regularly include this content in their classes. So there's a difference between values and then actual practice. So while a higher number of educators felt that DEI content was always needed in their classes, a lower percentage of educators actually included this content in their classes. So next, I want to talk a little about some of the themes that arose from my semi-structured interviews. So the first theme that arose is that it's about sort of this idea of using an umbrella for DEI content. So when participants spoke about certain DEI topics, say ethics, they felt like 3 or 4 other topics were kind of included under ethics. So they would say things like, well, I talk about ethics, so therefore I feel like I talk about equity and justice and context, without necessarily saying, today we're going to talk about context and justice and equity. Rather, we're going to talk about ethics. And so I thought this was interesting because it almost felt like, well, if I can talk about these 1 or 2 things, therefore I can talk about 8 other things. The next theme I think is the most interesting to me personally, which is about avoiding harm. So participants, when they spoke about DEI topics and teaching these topics in their classes, they often spoke about it only in the context of trying to help their students avoid harm in their engineering or in their design. So they would say things like, I want my students to understand, a wide variety of stakeholders who their designs could be affecting, rather than saying things like, I want to teach these topics to my students because I want them to strive for justice, and I see this information as a positive asset to their learning. And so participants spoke about DEI topics being uncomfortable and big and hard. And if you're only talking about those topics in the context of avoiding harm, they're gonna seem bigger, they're gonna seem more uncomfortable. So I thought that this was a really interesting insight from my work. The next thing that I want to discuss is the tension between humanities and engineering. Previous literature from engineering education also finds this distinction that people see between the humanities and generally the STEM fields. However, in the context of my work, I feel it goes a little bit deeper. It wasn't just that faculty saw there was a separation between engineering and humanities, rather that the humanities can contextualize harder topics better. So it almost felt like participants felt, well, I can talk about, these topics, but after that, I can't, right? After that, we need to leave it to the humanities to do it. However, I personally feel that this is actually an assumption. I don't always feel that the humanities or arts tackle these topics better than engineering. The next thing that I want to talk about is some of the activities that I did with my participants in Mural. So one of the first activities I had them do was I had a list of DEI topics, and I had them place them on this bullseye target relative to how important they thought the topics were to their class or to their field. And so some of the most common topics put in the center were accessibility, equity and equality, ethics, communication, and context. And in the next exercise, I asked them to do a very similar activity, but rather this time I asked them to rate them about ease of integration. So how do they actually feel like they can actually integrate these topics into their classes and teach them? And so the most common topics put in the center were ethics, environment, communication, context, and accessibility. And if you notice, the only topic that didn't make it into the center of the second target was equity and equality. Another activity that I had my participants do was to consider the taxonomy of significant learning. So this taxonomy was created by Dr. D. Fink, and he really believed that these 6 learning dimensions were critical and foundational to a student having what he called a significant learning experience, and for students to actually not only be able to retain information, but become better learners. And so I asked participants to consider this taxonomy in the context of teaching DEI topics, or how they teach DEI topics. So I asked them to place the star icon on the dimension that they felt was most important to them when teaching DEI. I asked them to place the question mark on the dimension that they felt was hardest, and the check mark on the dimension that they felt was easiest. And something interesting to note here is that the hardest dimensions that teachers felt like were the hardest to meet were caring and foundational knowledge. And something interesting to note here is that this was almost evenly divided by gender lines. So almost all female identifying participants identified caring as the hardest dimension to meet, and almost all male identifying participants found foundational knowledge as the hardest dimension to meet. So in conclusion, as I look forward to wrapping up my work, I will be doing a second iteration on my prototype with a graphic designer to help elevate both the aesthetic and visual communication of the cards. And then further down the road, I would love for the cards to be tested in small groups of engineering educators to get more feedback for a third iteration. And I'm really excited to incorporate the feedback that I've received from educators about how can I incorporate actual activities that teachers have used as potential examples in the cards, and considering ways to integrate DEI topics into assignments that professors are already using. And so this was some really valuable and critical feedback that I got from my participants, as well as adding visuals or icons. So when we think about the future of engineering and design, if we want it to be more equitable and inclusive, we need to begin thinking about how we actually teach those engineers. Thank you. And now I will be taking questions. Yes, Deepa. No, I haven't actually gotten to test the cards. When I conducted the interviews, I decided to hold them virtually because at the time, the COVID numbers were extremely high. And so I just felt that it was in the best interest of my participants to conduct the interviews virtually. And I wanted to use my interviews really as a way to get to have them be actually informed by experiences of engineering educators, knowing that there would be more testing needed for the cards. Yes.
You're on the verge. You've done some wonderful things. You've got some great observations now. It's really exciting to hear a lot of those observations. And it seems like you're also now right on the cusp of doing something very tricky. And wondering how some of the observations, have you imagined what impacts they might have on your cards? Maybe you think that they haven't done it yet, but have you got any ideas of how those observations might impact or influence the design of the cards, or maybe the selection of which cards are relevant, or maybe new cards that haven't emerged yet? Any of that matters is still too early.
Well, I think some of the suggestions that were really helpful in thinking about the next iteration of the cards were thinking about some sort of way to get the cards to think about how do I integrate DI topics into activities that professors are already doing. So that was when participants spoke about some of the barriers to integrating DI topics into their course content. They talked about, well, you know, I only have so much time, or this is a 3-credit course, so I can't really introduce like new activities. So it would be great if these could show me how I could integrate these into things that I'm already doing. Yeah, so that theme I think is really the most interesting to me personally, because it's weird because a lot of the participants that I interviewed understood the importance and understood the value of these topics and integrating them into course content. But there was like a deep, almost like this hesitation to talk about them any other way but this way. So a hesitation to talk about them outside of the context of or I don't know how to talk about these topics other ways. And so something that I wasn't able to show here, but some of the topics that were moved to the further of the margins of topics that were most important were things like systems of oppression, acts of oppression, prejudice and hatred, which I think is really interesting.
Jennifer Munster's asking about whether you consider the cards could become a book.
About whether the cards could become a book. Oh, I have not considered that yet. I think I've mainly just been focusing on the cards, but that's a really interesting idea. Yes.
What was the challenge or it strikes me that this work is potentially a solo activity that an individual instructor might reflect on their own curriculum and what they might be able to do in their class. Or have any vocal teaching or have the opportunity to have more so that you can maximize where people have this experience and challenges and it's not so like
Yeah, I actually think my personal preference for these cards would actually for them to be used in sort of like a workshop setting with like facilitators from maybe like CRLT or something like that, who are like experts in pedagogy and course design. Some of the feedback from participants can be contradictory sometimes. So sometimes I had one participant say that, you know, they could see this being used by themselves, but others say it maybe wouldn't be as helpful to do it by yourself because then it would just reaffirm the topics that you already think you should teach. But yeah, that's a great point. Yes.
I'm curious about, you know, you had a divide between male and female. We're interested in putting another question for like main books, AI community as part of that study, just kind of like have different things. But I remember
Yeah, so one participant chose not to disclose their gender, and rather than, for my survey, when asked about gender, I decided to leave it just an open-ended question rather than a multiple choice, because I wanted participants to be able to just self-identify. So some people just wrote woman, or some people wrote cis woman, or I prefer not to disclose. I did not ask about sexual orientation, and a part of me I kind of go back and forth about like whether or not I should have, and really like at what point I should have stopped, because I could have kept going and been like, you know, religion and this and this. And so I felt like at some point I don't know. I go back and forth about whether or not I should have maybe. So yeah, thank you for bringing that point up. Yes, Nick.
Were there things that you discovered using the virtual format that might be unique to that format that wouldn't be the same if you're in person? For instance, is there a certain degree of anonymity that people might process those responses with off or there's distance? Can you anticipate any changes in the shifts in virtual activities?
Yeah, that's a good question. I actually wonder if doing the interviews virtually actually, if some participants participated because it was virtual, and I maybe would not have gotten them if it was in person per se. I do think that virtual in some ways, it feels definitely more distant than maybe being in person would. But yeah, those are the first things that come to mind. Okay, thank you so much.
Thank you, Kendall. Our next presenter is Mikayla Buford. Before coming to Ann Arbor, Mikayla attended the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she earned her BS in computer science. There, she became interested in interdisciplinary projects that merge design and technology. She describes herself as a creative technologist and designer who is passionate about studying Black relationships with tech through making. Welcome, Mikayla.
One moment, I have to open up my notes. Well, hello everyone. The title of my project is Black Feminist Games for Justice, Reimagining Computer Science Education Through Youth-Led Game Design. So I first just want to start out saying that the program that I created is through a collaborative effort of myself and two undergraduate students that I hired, Ashni and Aminata. So Black Feminist Games for Justice, or BFG for J, is a series of 5 workshops meant for teens of color to explore game design, and also for them to discuss issues of power and discrimination in digital spaces using frameworks from Black feminist thought. So to understand how I came to this program, I'm going to talk about the problems surrounding computer science education, my motivations, then go into the approach I took to designing the workshops before talking about my partners, the process, and the specific workshops that I did or I planned, and then some reflections from our first 2 workshops. So I just want to first say that this project is deeply tied to my experience as a computer science student. I went to Madison, and it's a predominantly white institution. So in computer science, I often found myself as the only Black woman in my classes, maybe the only Black person. So it was difficult for me to see myself even in the curriculum, because most of the faculty members were white or Yes, or white. So I found through my own personal experience and even looking into literature on computer science education is that traditional computer science curriculum doesn't appropriately address the ethical and social implications of technology design. I think my topic is very similar to Kendall's, where we both see that the education that engineers, technologists, designers are experiencing do not appropriately teach them about the social, economic, environmental, and political considerations around a certain problem space. And I believe for myself that we cannot advocate for the representation of BIPOC technologists and designers into the tech field if we don't address the history of technology and how it perpetuates oppression, mistreatment of workers, harassment, and bias. So knowing all of this, we must equip the next generation of engineers and technologists and designers with the language and experience to understand the nuances of designing technology. I wanted to talk about briefly a project that I did before I came here. It's called Don't Touch My Hair, and I created an interactive sculpture named Zara, has an afro, and in her hair I embedded sensors that were meant to detect if someone touched her hair without asking. And this project was really exciting because it didn't come out of a class. I wasn't prompted to create something that was born out of my own experience and experience shared by a lot of Black women. But it was really interesting to start thinking about how do I create a piece of technology that is meant to teach about the Black experience. And so in my project, I'm hoping to inspire another generation of students to produce this type of interdisciplinary work by embedding the kinds of opportunities in computer science curriculum for them to express themselves. So in my journey in being in the MDes program, I've gone through a lot of different topics before I finally hit thinking about computer science education. And I found that in all the topics I was looking at, there were two running themes: technology education and thinking about how are we teaching those who are most often using a certain piece of technology, thinking about surveillance, thinking about those who are monitored, and how do we educate them about the way that the technology works and how to resist its oppression. And then the second theme was considering what is the relationship that Black communities have with a particular piece of technology. So I came to work on this particular topic because I felt that I knew most about considering how should we go about teaching computer science, where it integrates not just making, but also having critical discussions and seeing how do those two things affect one another. So my research question within this topic of reimagining computer science education is how might we use integrative design to create an after-school program for teens of color to learn the fundamentals of game design and to engage in discussion about social activism through Black feminist theory. So with this research question, I took to the integrative design approach. I'm going to first define integrative design. I define it as a multidisciplinary approach to designing with various stakeholders to create intentional change and build more sustainable and equitable systems. So the first methodology that I brought in was value-centered design. It's an approach to technology design that centers human values, most often ethical values, throughout the design process. From here, I'm bringing in values at play, which is a derivative of VSD, and it looks more specifically at how do we embed values into a game through the game definition or its mechanics or rules, the makeup of the team, and even the project expectations. So an example of a human value could be caring, cooperation, sustainability, or sharing. Let's get the slide. Okay. And lastly, I'm bringing in Black feminist thought to my approach as my social theory to guide the discussions that we'll be having. So Black feminist thought is a theory of knowledge that justifies that Black women have a unique standpoint based on the intersections of their race, gender, and class with power structures. So now getting into the project, I'm going to talk about the goals and objectives before going into process and partners. So I have three main goals. First, that we build a communal space for teens to explore game design and to feel comfortable trying and failing. Second is that we would have thoughtful discussions about technology and games and analyzing them using Black feminist thought and a couple of game design frameworks. And third, for them to learn to be reflective and playful designers. So to see through those goals, I have 4 objectives. First, that the teens learn basic game design fundamentals. Second, that they would learn what Black feminist thought is and applications of its theory in games, in music, and in art. Third is for the teens to learn 2 different game design softwares, Twine and MakeCode. And then lastly, that they'll be creating playable game prototypes in teams. So my project partners are here locally and also not locally. So I'm working with the Neutral Zone in Ann Arbor. They are a youth-led organization downtown that serves more than 150 teens from the Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti area. And I'm also working with Hussein Rizvi, who's an MIT senior, who created a program called Games for Justice, which is the OG. And they're working with me as a consultant on the curriculum that I developed for the workshops. So this is a picture of the Neutral Zone. You've maybe driven past it. If you haven't, certainly drive past it. Coolest space downtown. And I have a quick video of the art room. It's where we are running all of the workshops. I'm trying to speed up this video a little bit. So you can see it's a really dynamic space. There's a lot of art supplies, books, computers. It's a really creative space for us to use. So I have the 5 workshops. And each workshop has a general structure of first having a warm-up activity, whether that's them playing a game, maybe it's something that's on the computer or a more physical game. Next, we'll move to having a discussion. So in our second workshop, we did introduction to Black feminist thought. So we defined terms like oppression and privilege, and then went into how are those words defined in Black feminist thought. And we played a couple of games afterwards, showing how Black women are using their personal experience as a way to teach others through games, how to be more respectful. So after we will play a game that ties into a discussion, we'll then do some kind of design activity, or we'll have a software tutorial. And then lastly close with an exit survey, which is what I'm using primarily for collecting data on what did teams think about the activities that we did today, what was the most important thing that they learned, and also, excuse me, I blinked for a second. Also learning what was something that we maybe missed that they wanted to talk about. Okay, so I want to let you all know that we've been able to do 2 workshops so far. So these are really preliminary thoughts and observations. So first is that the space that we've created has been predominantly Black. At the Neutral Zone, 75% of the teens of color there are Black, and those are the teens who have been coming to our program. On my team, most of us are Black, and so when we are all together, the teens and my team, it's a really interesting and unique space, especially since in computer science and even in game design, having a predominantly Black team or space is very, very rare. So there's been just a unique opportunity for us to really share our personal experiences, especially in workshop 2 and thinking about Black feminist thought, being able to give those students language to their own experience and know that it's not just something that they experience by themselves. Another observation is that interactive activities are so important for these workshops. Even though we have discussions, we'll often make slides to teach the kids concepts, go through fundamentals, but with slides, people can get very disengaged easily, especially teens. So making sure that we have enough time for us to ask them questions, to do activities like this card deck that we are using called Grow a Game. It's developed by the founders of Values at Play. And in our second workshop, we had them choose 2 value cards and 1 verb card. So the values are the blue ones and the verbs are the green, and then have the teens come up with a game concept based on those 2. So activities like this are great ways to keep them engaged, but also have them interact with the curriculum much more. One challenge that's been very hard at bringing teens into the space is low attendance and recruitment. In this past 2 years, the neutral zone has been closed. They've been doing virtual drop-in hours. And so with that, they've lost contact with a lot of teens in the area, and new teens, who are in high school, in middle school, don't know much about the neutral zone. And so right now, the neutral zone is trying to focus on welcoming teens back into the space. And so for us who are running programs, not just myself, but other staff members, it's been hard to get teens to come consistently, bring new teens in from schools, just due to certain challenges. Well, for us, we find that even if we have low attendance, it's a great way for us to connect more deeply with the teens who do come and try to guide the curriculum to be more focused on what they are interested in. So moving forward from those challenges, we're thinking about what are new recruitment strategies that we can use. Can we try to incentivize the teens with gift cards, with candy to come that day and see what the workshops are about? There's this thought about shifting to having a big event. At the neutral zone, they're thinking, what's going to be the thing to bring more teens into the space? Is it going to be programs or is it going to be events? So we're thinking possibly at the end of this month of doing just one big event where we have all of our design activities that we've created for our workshops, doing them in one big event so more teens can learn about what game design is, understanding how to move through the design process, and then also have those discussions. And thank you for listening. I'll now take questions. Okay. Your question, I'm going to repeat the question and let me know if I said it wrong. So you're asking from the first to the second workshop, was there a difference in how the teens approach like the games, or like in terms of like when we did it the second, not we did the second, but like when we had the second one, we like approach our curriculum differently? Okay, yes, okay. So the question was, from the teens who came to the first workshop to, those who came to the second workshop, did I see a difference? Is that your question? Okay. So I will say, we unfortunately had less teens come to the second workshop just because the day of the week, it was warm outside, so a lot of teens didn't show up that day at the neutral zone. But I did find with the teen who did come that they were much more engaged in the design activities that we had that day. So for our first workshop, we had an activity where we had them design a spork. So we gave them a design constraint and had them use paper and Play-Doh and pencils to come up with a design for a spork. And then we told them that, okay, now you're designing a spork for an astronaut. And now you're designing a spork for an astronaut who's eating watermelon. And so that was a really great activity for them to understand, the iterative process of design and understanding that you're working within a certain context. So I found like the teens who did that activity liked it, but they kind of were like waving in and out of being engaged in it. But I think with the second workshop, doing the Grow a Game cards was much better, I think, in terms of helping them understand like, how do you create an idea for a game without having like too much like basic knowledge of like how do you create a game or something. I think with like a sport, like a team will already possibly like have an idea of what a sport is like, so they're going to kind of use that as like the basis. But with the game cards, it was like really trying to get them to think creatively on their own of creating something new that they've probably never played before. So yeah. All right.
Okay, first question from Kelly. Can you talk a little bit more about how you strike a balance between introducing Black feminist theory and game design processes in the workshop?
Yes. It's been very difficult trying to make that balance and make sure that the concepts that I'm introducing from Black feminist thought, because this kind of theory is very academic, even though it's based in and rooted in the experience of everyday Black women. Figuring out how to translate that into teens that's understandable for them. I also think about like, how is this connecting to the making activities that we're doing? I'm talking about game design. And so I think it's taken a lot of time. We've done like 7 iterations of our curriculum so far, trying to work out kinks and understand like, how do we make sure that the concepts of the matrix of domination or intersectionality is relating to how someone's going to develop a game. So a really amazing book that I've been using to guide the game design process has been Rules at Play, written by Katie Salin and Eric Zimmerman. And in one of the chapters, they describe games as systems and thinking about how games have objects and attributes and they're part of an environment. And that's something I really latched onto and started thinking like, how can I use this concept to also be in the discussion of understanding like systemic oppression and like how can someone kind of analyze, the institution of a school or thinking about their family and understand like ways that they're experiencing possible bias or how they understand discrimination that's happening to them, using like Black feminist thought and thinking about systemic oppression, but also kind of thinking about like games as systems. So it's been difficult in trying to find ways that both of these topics will kind of be in communication with one another. It's really rewarding when it does work out, but it's really hard to kind of strike that balance. And I don't think I'm going to be doing it perfectly. It's going to take probably years of more studying to figure out how to balance, both of those things in the classroom.
Okay.
Thank you, Deba. Yeah.
So, what, in terms of future work, because you were talking about science education and how Kendall's work is like more type of aptly undergraduate faculty and curriculum. So I see your work is like more community oriented. And have you thought of how do you think that's like in the future that somehow this should be integrated in design stuff, or like how do you bridge this project and the workshops and the outcomes to computer science education?
Yes.
And establishing a Black feminist pathway?
Yes. Okay. The question was, do I see this work later being applied to, a more like the college experience, thinking about curriculum for computer science, or maybe more specifically game design at a college? Yes, I think something I didn't talk about in my slides is like why I chose high school students versus thinking about instead of undergrads and trying to do some kind of program here at the University of Michigan. And I think there was maybe 2 factors. First, I tried to make connections with programs already here on campus and student organizations. And then also, trying to find youth-like organizations who were, had more high school students, and it was the neutral zone that contacted me the earliest. So it was a little bit of like, well, a little bit of elimination, but I think the opportunity of working with high school students is to start getting young people thinking a lot earlier about how computer science isn't just like a lucrative field to get into, because you can make great money and that's really important also. But knowing that when you enter that field that you're entering a lot of things as someone who is Black, who is Latina. And so I just felt really excited about working with high schoolers. I think also, you know, we can think like, oh, I don't know, what kind of game would a high schooler want to make? Maybe they'd make something like Among Us. But in working with these high schoolers, like they have really great ideas. They are very aware of their place in the world and the way that other people, and the way that power structures work. So I am really happy about the opportunity of working with high school students. I would love to, you know, keep continuing to develop this work and end up doing it with college students. But I think just right now the opportunity was with the neutral zone. So thank you for that question.
There's another Zoom question that's along similar lines.
Okay.
But about if you had considered elementary school students.
Yeah, I don't think I considered that young because the social theory that I'm using is so theoretical, and I'm a junior scholar, so I'm not yet like, I haven't had more years of experience in applying Black feminist thought. I think there's other scholars out there that are doing really great work, working with elementary age students on, you know, doing computer science or STEM programs, but also integrating topics of DEI, you know, whether that's specifically about racial bias, algorithmic bias, you know, more broadly, or thinking about, trying to think of like specific projects. I know there was a scholar out of MIT who was creating an elementary school program to teach like AI and AI ethics. I think that's someone who like did a PhD. And so I think, yeah, for me, elementary school, I think was a little bit too young because I just feel like the topics I was trying to work on, I think could be, I could first start out trying to translate that to high school students easier than thinking about elementary school students.
Great, thank you, Mikayla. Our next presenter is Sarah Miles. Sarah earned her bachelor's degree in sociology here at U of M and her master's of social work degree from Columbia. By joining the MDes program, Sarah comes home to Michigan after 10 years away. For 2 of those years, she was a Peace Corps volunteer in Honduras. For 8 of those years, she was a practicing social worker in New York City, specializing in child and adolescent mental health programs. Sarah is fired up about addressing the issues in our complicated, impractical, and burdensome social systems, and motivated by collaborators and activists who are doing what they can to chip away at these wicked problems. Welcome, Sarah.
Okay. Okay. And the slideshow. Okay. Great. So thanks everybody for coming. Yeah, so I'm Sarah. My project is From Theory to Action, exploring process for trauma-informed approaches in design. So Joe already said a little bit about how I got here, but I wanted to give some context about why this is the project that I chose. So I started off pretty quickly after undergrad in community-based programs. So that was through Peace Corps. I did a short 3-month AmeriCorps stint with high schoolers, and then I was working in nonprofits. So that was the basis of where I'm coming from, and really learned a lot about working with communities and what my values are within that. And then I decided I really want some more focus in my life. So I moved to social work, or not moved to, but added social work to my education and training, which what is like a value with people in my life. I know a lot of social workers before and after I went to school. So it's well within my circle, and I like the values that social work brings, which is sort of this understanding of where people are coming from, and it's just baked into the practice. And so I landed pretty organically on child and adolescent mental health within that. And when you work with children and youth, you pretty much can encounter you work with families, you work with schools, so you work with like pretty much any institution and system that touches people. And I kept coming up against the same issues and barriers as I was doing that. And my sort of practical mind was like, this makes no sense. There must be an easier way to do things. And so I wasn't necessarily planning to go back or come back to grad school, but MDes really stuck out to me as sort of hitting some of those questions that I still had as a practicing social worker that wanted to sort of move into some of the systemic work. So the theme within all of that is sort of, I want to redesign the way that we work in social impact spaces so that the process and outcomes are meaningful, ethical, and guided by respect for choice and self-determination. So we want to make an impact, but that doesn't always, like, the process is extremely important, which is also something I learned sort of working in various communities with different access to services and resources. So moving to design, MDes is very focused on social impact, which I love about it. And the scope of design is changing. However, one thing that I noticed coming in here and reading through the methodologies is that a lot of them kind of sound like therapy in a lot of ways. The way that we ask questions and engage communities and talk about people's lives can very easily like sound like therapy. And so one thing that was something that really stuck out to me as someone who's trained to provide therapy, and how our designers learning to engage with people in that way. So one thing that I'm really concerned with in design now is we must and can learn how to engage empathetically, intentionally, supportively, and equitably. And that we must have a dual focus on theory and praxis. So when we have a mindset like trauma-informed design, which I'll talk about, or design justice, how is that actually impacting our practice? So my project has 3 main goals: demonstrate the potential of trauma-informed design practices. So how can are there ways that we can use it to improve our engagement and maybe have more of the impact that we're hoping to? Explore skills and tools. So what are the more concrete things that we're doing within our practice to move forward with it? And create pathways to praxis. So how can we have theory and action sort of in one pathway? So one huge barrier that I keep coming across in this work is the perception of trauma as a term. And so I just want to briefly talk about the different understandings of trauma. So there is a clinical practice. So treatment, PTSD is the common diagnosis we see, but that's not enough. You don't have to have that diagnosis to have it impact your life and treatment and mental health. And diagnoses, so that's where clinical practice really lives. Non-clinical practice, which is where design is, would be organization, policy, procedure, values that are more broad in terms of like how we interact with people. And then the popular understanding, which is typically specific to natural disaster, abuse, neglect. The list could be endless. But the more sort of like extreme versions of what we picture as trauma is highly stigmatized and anxiety inducing. And so, you know, moving into more, for me, more of the pink and green areas, the understanding within clinical practice is like that broad understanding and individual understanding is there. So now it's translating it to a broader audience. And my project really lives in the middle, which is with all of them. So what do I mean by trauma informed? So an interdisciplinary approach. So many people can work on this and should be collaborating. That applies principles which are known to mitigate the impact of trauma and integrates them more broadly into practice. So trauma informed does come from what we know to help people who have experienced trauma. However, because we don't always know who's experienced trauma and whose life experience are impacting them, we're not like testing everybody and assessing them for trauma. So we integrate them broadly. And we also understand that trauma is not just one thing. I mean, it's many things. And that the practices must be understood within the context of socio-political, economic, and historical and racialized society. So all of the wicked problems that we're talking about are really wrapped up in where people are coming from in terms of what they bring into the space with them. So just briefly, I don't have time to really go into this, but I'm working from the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration 6 principles. And there are many ways to look at trauma, but this is one that I chose because it's interdisciplinary from mental health. So the principles are safety, trustworthiness and transparency, peer support, collaboration and mutuality, empowerment, voice and choice, and cultural, historical, and identity issues. So moving to my work, so I felt pretty strong that I understood how I wanted to talk about trauma informed from a non-design perspective, but I was really needing that design exposure. So I partnered with Convergence Design Lab in Chicago. That is a 100% woman-owned learning design studio. And they do a lot of consulting, evaluation, program planning for youth programs and education programs. So I've been building my relationship with them and now moving into more of a workshop phase, which I'll talk about. But before I even got there, through my research, secondary research, my desk research was, how do we sort of zoom out and ask people to get into this work? And so stage 1, I sort of point out as theory. So it's really important to know what is trauma informed, how does it apply to design more broadly, sort of the nuts and bolts of trauma, and how it impacts our work. But then moving to the second stage would be ideology, which I'm defining as being more reflective about yourself as a person in your practice and in your organization. And then stage 3 being application, which I think is where, because this is such an emerging conversation where people are really stuck, which is like, how do we actually apply this to our work right now? And then the 4th stage would be assessment, which is sort of a reflection, like an intentional reflection on how you've been applying this work to your practice. So before I did workshops with my partners, we had a lot of conversations and I participated in some of their activities. And one of the things that I did with them is create an interview protocol, an interview that talked about, and we really sort of dug through and connected it back to the principles. And so being very mindful of approaching that conversation from a trauma-informed lens. And then the first workshop, we really focused on theory, and I was hoping to get from them, and this was February 2nd, so it's only been 6 weeks or so, whatever day it is today. And so we talked more about theory. So I was hoping to get from them how they view the principles and if they can even fit in their practice. And then sort of talked a little bit more about what this might actually look like in practice. So how adverse experiences can manifest within their interactions. The second workshop I did was sort of an experiment on moving a mental health concept into design. And I think it already happens to some extent in design, but a case review model. So one designer explaining their project, the issues they're having, the successes, and then questions for the team, and then having like an hour-long discussion just about these things. And I added the dimensions of the trauma-informed principles with that. And then the third workshop we did was topic specific to learning design. So I chose resources, having worked in New York City schools, I chose resources that I knew that were helpful to me in working there. So we had about an hour and a half talking about explicitly how this fit into their work. And this actually felt like the most useful workshop because it really seemed to click for this one. So I do wish I had done this one second. So next steps. So next steps in this project are I'm working on a website with a web designer to share tools and expand the discussion around trauma-informed design. So I really hope to like really highlight the practice element of it so that we're moving from sort of mindset and framework to this is what it actually means. And then finalize my partner work. They've been extremely generous with time and knowledge. So hoping to help them visualize and document this work. So then beyond this project, because it's such a small sliver that I'm working on right now, so investigate concepts with more design methods and approaches. So what I've really been focused on now are the like interview, engagement, like relationship building parts of design, but not as much beyond that. And so I'm hoping to move towards that. Expand to additional parts of the trauma-informed design process. So I really want to get to the more application and reflection assessment parts, but I haven't been able to quite yet. Connect with more designers and collaborators and implement within more specialty areas. So beyond learning design, which is a really exciting form of design, but what would this look like in service design or civic design, industrial design, potentially product design. So what could this actually mean? And so let's see, and then a special thanks to my advisors, Deepa, Frank, and Larry, who have been extremely helpful in this process. So thank you. Any questions? Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering if, I know when you talk about this interview questions sounding therapeutic, expand on the risk of interviews sounding like they're
Yeah, so I think that, so first of all, your relationship building with a group of people around really intense, sensitive personal topics. So I'm trying to think of an example that we like, the example that really stuck out to me, but if we are, for example, like approaching the wicked problem of poverty, which we as a group have been approaching, like if we're trying to get context from people and saying, what are your experiences with poverty? It can like be extremely traumatizing to talk about, and then we're digging more into the other impacting systems. So your family life, you're asking questions about, you know, the hardships that you face. And in therapy, you really learn how to give that information or take that information essentially and give something back to the client, which would be to help them think through that. But in design, I think we risk not giving them, not also then providing that reciprocal relationship with people. So how do we help people think through what's already happening, which could happen in the process, but I think if we're not careful, that it could be really risky to do that and then just leave and maybe not have that long-term relationship that therapy would have. Yeah. This is an interesting anecdote, which I actually was inspired by when I went to do jury duty. They asked everybody if they've experienced or if they've been a victim of crime. And it is a really traumatizing question to ask people. When I went, somebody was like clearly traumatized by their experience and left the room. And I just imagined her like going off and just having like a terrible day after that because they brought it up and she didn't really want to talk about it. So that's just not related to this, but why it like sticks with me as being really impactful. Yeah. My Pfizer. Mhm.
From our conversations over the past 2 years, I understood this as, especially like for the training designers to be using these approaches in their projects. But I was just like curious to see that maybe also promote discussion about how we follow and be at it.
Mm. Mm.
Yes, of course, what we
Yeah, I mean, I think that the design, I'm the first, to provide therapy alongside the design process. But I do think that designers, even if they can't provide therapy, have a role in, like, there are lots of programs that people who are in therapy also do art programs and music and all of those things. So I think that the potential of the design process is that it can be really creative and move people in a way that they might not, that the designer, it might be intentional or it might not be, but it is providing people with something that maybe I'm advocating that it be more intentional and that designers know their role within that, which is really important. And like therapy is not the only thing that people need in their lives, although it is very important. But like people do have like very robust lives and that the design process could really support that as well. Yeah.
Maybe with that, what are some of the mistakes that designers do when they create this based on their experience?
So in reading, especially like interview transcripts based on design research, just having sort of, and though it's hard in text to see like what was the relationship actually like, but to me, bringing up questions and having people answer things like, I was, neglected as a child, and this is why I am the way that I am. And, in the text, it may not have been reflected, but I think that can be an uncomfortable disclosure for people who aren't used to dealing with that. So it could just be like, oh, I'm sorry that happened and let's move on, as opposed to like a deeper discussion about what is a designer's role when that happens. Do we need to take a minute and just like reflect, or does that person need some time to have a break from the conversation, or what are the mechanisms that are set up when that comes up if someone's not ready to talk about that? So I think that the mistake that designers could make is like bringing up something or not being ready for something that could potentially like leave someone feeling worse than when they came in. Yeah. So your question is, how am I combining the three ways of understanding trauma? Why? Oh, so having been a therapist and then, or a direct service social worker, and then moving to more programmatic, and then working in school systems around it, I really saw the benefits, and I'm an advocate for being trauma informed. And I think that you can be that, like, even if you're not at work, if you're just like at a, I don't know, if like someone you meet on the street is having a bad day. So just in general, I advocate for being trauma informed based on my understanding. But I think that that's the problem, is that it is such a charged word that when you say like I'm trauma informed, it could sound like you're talking about deficits, and there's a lot of debate about whether trauma informed is the right term to even use. So I think it's just a matter of like finding the terminology that fits within that. So popular understanding, I think that's a harder one, but I feel pretty confident that professionals in other contexts can adopt it. It is happening in design. It's a new concept, but it happens in schools, it happens in hospitals. And so just sort of finding the inroad to the new profession, I think, is a really important thing. I hope that answers your question. We're done. Okay. Where's Steph? Which? Okay, okay.
Oh no, on the last slide, that's not on the presentation.
Great, thank you, Sarah. Our final presenter tonight is Stephanie Szemetylo. Stephanie earned her Bachelor of Science in Industrial Design from the University of Cincinnati. She then joined Kohler's Kitchen and Bath Design team, where she contributed to innovative design, research, and sustainability efforts. She quickly found that her interests and approach to design went far beyond the role of a traditional industrial designer, and decided to return to school to equip herself to address the design challenges of the 21st century. Welcome, Stephanie.
All right, hello. Oh, do I need to share my screen again? Okay, I have to lean in real small. You can't tell in here, but the icons are like really tiny. All right, so we do have food in the back that you guys might be eating after this. And the folks who made this food are my project partner for this project. Yeah. So, yeah, I'll just get right into it. So with this project, my aim is to increase selection of low carbon, plant-rich dishes by implementing a series of design interventions in collaboration with a local restaurant, El Harissa, okay, as a climate change mitigation measure. And so this is El Harissa. I'm going to tell you a little bit about them. So El Harissa is this wonderful North African and Mediterranean restaurant, family owned, in the northwest corner of Ann Arbor. And Yusuf in the center here with his family has been my primary collaborator on this project. And he's here this evening, which is really nice. So El Harissa has about 30 scratch-made dishes that they pre-pack and sell in their deli case to go. They also have gelato and a really wonderful boutique market. And I'm working with them not just to help them out with some like graphic design stuff, but when I approached them back in September, they were interested in working with me because they have some core values that they really want to express through their business. So they are really present in the community. They want to connect with local talent, different organizations. They want to educate people and their customers through their food, and they want to move the needle on sustainability and take on practices that are just better for the environment. So for example, is the returnable container pilot, which they've been doing with the city of Ann Arbor. And before I go into all of the collaboration and fun stuff we did, I want to situate you in the wicked problem that we are addressing. So in 2020, the city of Ann Arbor adopted A20, which is a community-wide carbon neutrality plan. And it covers a lot of different strategies, from implementing mass transit, a wider network, to energy efficiency, and also with food. And so one of those actions is supporting a plant-rich diet. And by plant-rich, it means decreasing the amount of meat on your plate, the amount of animal products, or eliminating them entirely. And it can be a range from flexitarian all the way to vegan. And taking on this way of eating is a really impactful thing that we can do as individuals to mitigate our carbon footprint. And I'll show you why, how that works. So these are the greenhouse gas emissions associated with pretty common protein products from animals and from plants. And you can see that beef is pretty high. In fact, it's 28 times higher than dry beans, which is quite significant. So you can see that the savings by switching to plant-sourced proteins is pretty significant. And put another way, if you had a budget of carbon to spend, so 1 kilogram of greenhouse gases, this is what you can get. So you could spend it on 1.2 ounces of beef or beans for days. And so, yeah, this sounds cool. It's like a really great thing to do, but there are a lot of obstacles to transitioning to this way of eating, and taste is one of those obvious things. Most people like the taste of meat. And another one that I'll highlight is that some folks who are just like unfamiliar with different types of plant-based dishes, maybe not sure how to prepare them, or they don't have enough time to prepare them. And then in a restaurant context, which is where I'm working in, most of us have the desire to treat ourselves when we're dining out, and taste becomes like the thing that we care the most about generally when we're in that context, compared to thinking about the environment or about health or price even. And if you do go to a restaurant with the intent of trying out some plant-based options, trying to be vegetarian, you might be disappointed and just have to stick with the ever-present bowl of pasta. Yeah, and I'll get into the process that Yusuf and I went through. And yeah, so I adapted this design methodology called Design for Sustainable Behaviors into my project that moves from understanding the context in which we're designing, and then moving to identifying behavior change strategies to implement, and then creating the materials to support those strategies, then testing them out, see what happens. Do we move the needle at all? So the first step was doing some observations at El Harissa and seeing how customers interact with the food displays and with the staff, and with the space itself, revealed some firsthand insight for me, and it informed interviews that I conducted with some customers of El Harissa. So we decided to do these online because COVID, and I also used Mural, like many of my classmates, to facilitate those discussions. So I asked participants about recent visits to El Harissa. What are the things that they consider when they're ordering? Do environmental considerations come into play, or how do they think about food and sustainability? And then that led into 2 generative design research activities, which I will make larger here. So in this planning process for these interviews, one thing that Yusuf was really interested in learning about was whether like a certain ingredient or balance of ingredients would attract people. So if a dish had okra in it, would more people get it? Or if it had squash, would that attract more people? So rather than just giving participants a checklist of like, what vegetables do you like to eat? I created this El Harissa test kitchen activity where I asked them to compose their ideal plant-rich dish as if it were to be hypothetically sold at El Harissa. And this revealed many angles of information. So on one hand, it led to discussions about certain ingredients that sounded interesting or pairings of ingredients that they like or don't like, to talking about hangups and barriers around plant-rich eating. So you'll notice in the corner, there's a whole section on plant-based protein. So I asked about, are there things that, or have you tried any of these sorts of proteins? Do you incorporate it into your diet? Would you like to see these sorts of ingredients at El Harissa? If not, why? And then more obviously, like the dishes that these participants created can be used as inspiration by Yusuf and his family and staff to create new plant-rich dishes to throw on their menu. And so that activity led into this dish description activity where I had participants select words that describe their dish and to make it sound appealing on the menu. And this just added another layer of information onto their menu or their dish collage, so to speak. But it also generated conversation about certain words. So caramelized came up quite a bit, like, oh, if it says caramelized, like, oh, I want to get that. Except for the one person who doesn't like caramelized onions at all, which I thought was crazy. But anyway, and then words like local, people have different definitions of local. So understanding, like, in their mind, like, is it a radius, is it by state, and so forth. So all of this yielded a ton of data points, all of which I posted in the MDes studio. This is just a snapshot of that. So yeah, after collecting all this information, Yusuf and I parsed through this a few sessions, and I won't go into detail with all of the findings, but one of the most interesting findings to me was that customers tend to use the dish description that goes below the dish name when they're looking through the menu, and they pick up on these ingredients that are interesting. So like pomegranate molasses, like, ooh, exotic, and different types of spices. So that's a leverage point that led into strategy selection. In my literature review, I identified a bunch of different strategies that have been studied in various food contexts, and I'm not going to go into all of them, but they fall into three categories roughly. So one being informing, so communicating the environmental impact of a dish through words or numbers or symbols. And then there are nudging strategies which kind of go under the radar a bit and influence you, but don't take away the choice of selecting a meat-based dish. And then there are forcing strategies which eliminate the dish or eliminate meat from the menu. And those sort of strategies we did not pursue. Yusuf wasn't ready to do those sorts of things. So we focused on informing and nudging. And then to knit all of this together, I've made these really detailed customer experience journey maps looking at how, so integrating the findings kind of on one layer, and then where the strategies could be interjected in the experience. And I did this from a couple different pathways. So the ordering at El Harissa in person to doing a catering order and some other ones. And doing this outlined, John said, about 5 years worth of work. So I had to narrow it down to just the in-person experience dining and making your order at the deli counter. And so after many conversations with my advisors and with Yusuf, we identified two strategies. One, informational, so a carbon label to communicate what the lower carbon choice is, and then using appealing and sensory language to draw people in with these amazing ingredients that El Harissa uses in their food. So for that strategy, that led to some wordsmithing. And the thing about this project is, as I was writing these and working on other aspects, you get really hungry. So I'm sorry if I'm like making you hungry with all these images, but so yeah, with these, we were highlighting the flavor profiles, the textures, preparation, and so forth, to really paint a picture in your mind of what that dish might taste like. And then there's the carbon label, and I'll break that down for how that is working. So we'll use the chicken tagine as an example. So first you weigh a serving of the dish, and then identify the top ingredients, and I look up the emissions data associated with those ingredients. And for that, I referenced a database that was put together by researchers here at U of M. And then you multiply those numbers, and then you add those numbers, and then you get another number. And this number to most people doesn't really mean anything. The units don't really mean much. The units refer to kind of like a standardization of all greenhouse gas emissions because they have different impacts. But anyway, we opted to go for a 3-tier labeling system so that customers can see all the options that will be appearing on a menu board, don't have to deal with numbers because there's already price on there, and make it so that it's easier to kind of weigh the options. So all this work happened alongside sketching a menu board concept, and oh no, I only have 2 minutes, and exploration about this 3-tier system, the different variations, some of which were inspired by Tunisian and Moroccan design that Yusuf collected for me. So there was a lot of tinkering and bringing it to El Harissa, getting feedback from Yusuf, his family, and from his staff. And this is the semi-final design. There are a few things that we have to tweak and information to inject into here, but the final design will be a magnetic menu board that has movable tiles. So it's a flexible menu system for El Harissa. So as they have new dishes or they sell out of something, you can adjust accordingly. And for the purposes of this pilot, it'll just be printed on corrugated plastic. And here's a detail of the menu tiles with the descriptions and the carbon labeling. And then, so we'll be testing this next week, assuming that the sign people have a quick turnaround time. And so we'll be seeing if it shifts customer behavior. Do people understand the labels? How do the staff feel about it? And then all of that will all that feedback will go into another iteration of the menu board, alongside work that we've been doing with another course here at U of M, Frank Nuno Corco's Visual Identity and Branding course. They've taken on El Harissa as their client this semester. And at the end of the term, Yusuf and his family will select the concept that resonates with them the most and take that further across their whole business. And so after my part of the testing, I'll be converging with that selected student to integrate the findings with this more permanent menu board. And additionally, after I wrap up testing and analyze the information, I'll be creating a toolkit for Yusuf and his family and his staff to maintain the carbon labeling system and the description strategy system as they update their menu. And then finally, outline some other pathways that they can take in the future. So that's all I have, but I have people to acknowledge. It's a lot of people, but I would have to say the MVP is Yusuf, who is back there. You can wave. Yeah, he's been really generous with his time, and he's been involved in this whole design process from day one, and just been really happy to work with. And I hope that this project has impacted you positively and is impacted your business in a positive way as well. And then MVP award of my personal life goes to Laurel Hannah. She has supported me for a long time. I've babbled about this project for over a year and has fed me wonderful plant-rich dishes in that time frame. And that is all I have. And I hope you show up at El Harissa, try out their food that you don't already get to try here. And yeah, that's it. Thank you. Any questions? Yes. Okay.
I'm curious, what was the beneficial, useful, largest outcome for El Harissa? Was it object? Was it knowledge? You alluded to it very quickly. Especially when you talk about a more easier pathway. You're going to take something and move it across the whole program. I'm curious, what was the most significant outcome you suspect from their perspective and from your perspective?
Yeah, so it's kind of been, yes, I think it's kind of been this end-to-end design research, customer experience, sustainable behavior change design, and a little bit of visual identity and branding, although that goes more to the undergrad students than to me. So there are the design outputs of the strategies themselves, the menu board that we'll be testing, but I think just engaging in this process with Yusuf in particular, I think I've already started to shift a little bit of his thinking. He's mentioned to me a couple of times how he's trying to come up with even more indulgent sounding menu descriptions, and how when he's serving up dishes over at Pierpont and Maisie's here on campus twice a week, he's been saying like really pushing the word caramelized when describing the root vegetable and date tagine. So yeah, I mean, I think it's been really multifaceted. So that's my perspective. I don't know if Yusuf wants to say, but you can talk to him. You can talk to him later. Yeah. Right. Yes. Yeah. Yep.
We just have a question from the Zoom chat. Kelly asked, wondering if you could speak again about the timeline for testing the menu board. Sorry if I.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, I said here it says March 22nd. It's probably gonna be like the 23rd or the 24th, but we'll be testing it for about 2 weeks and seeing if the sales shift at all. I'll also have an exit survey for customers, and then I'll be conducting observations at El Harissa and maybe intercepting staff and customers if they seem chatty about the menu board. So yeah, that's the rough plan. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, originally in this process, I wanted to talk more directly with staff, but with some of the shortages that have been happening that everyone's aware of, that didn't really turn out to be a possibility. So some of this was just, when I brought in materials into El Harissa, the large menu boards, it was just receiving feedback kind of on the fly from them if they happen to be there. And I will admit it's been kind of a scattershot approach. So, yeah. Okay, we'll take a Zoom.
So one question is just, this might be a short one about, will there be a follow-up to see if the intervention made a difference?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be collecting the data and then seeing if the sales change from the 2 weeks prior to implementing it to the intervention period. And then that will be recorded in my oral defense at the minimum, so.
This is a sort of a two-directional question. So one is the behavior change for customers. There was something that came up in the early survey that people are interested, okay, with environmental information so long as it's not too guilty. What type of sort of forward-seeking behavior see individual customers do? So they have this experience that was clearly about the community values-based family business, and then they go to maybe they don't make business. How transferable is, do you see what they're doing is planting a seed and then I'm going to seek out this type of information in my business elsewhere, or do you see it as a business to business, like here's a values-oriented business that has done this experiment with foregrounding, thinking about sustainability, and maybe a business at a larger scale. This is part of this designer.
Can it be both? Yeah. I mean, I think it's both. In that, like, so I mean, one of the reasons why I felt comfortable with the carbon labeling is because the customer base is kind of this crunchy Ann Arbor intellectual-ish clientele, and they're more generally, based on the customer interviews that I had, just seem more receptive to learning. So yeah, it's just kind of like this mesh, this intersection between the customers that El Harissa serves, and then just like the inherent values that Yusuf and his family has in their business. And yeah.
It's a really nice synthesis. Project, I'm just sort of looking at whether it's El Harissa, not franchising, but is this a model for other businesses?
Yeah, I mean, it could be, depending upon a location, and the strategy might change a little bit. So there are different types of carbon labeling, but I don't know if you want me to go into that right now, but it could just be like a single symbol that says, this is the climate friendly choice, and just make it one thing that people can grasp. So there's kind of different ways to approach it. So. Mikayla? Thanks. Yeah, so I mean, that one dimension is like the economic bit of it, and like how those dishes translate to carbon saving. So there's like the quantitative aspect, which is what you're saying, but then there are some qualitative things I'll be collecting. So understanding what kind of conversations are being prompted because of this new menu board, either from the dish descriptions or from the carbon label. They might ask, oh, what the heck is this about? Like, and then hopefully there will be a positive conversation about it. But I'm also interested in hearing what's a negative conversation about it too, because if it's not working, then how can we edit it and implement it better in the next iteration. And then so that's coming from observation that I'll be doing in the test period. And then through survey data, I want to collect information on and did people even pick up on these labels or on these descriptions, and did it come into consideration when they were ordering their meal? So it's kind of a multi-faceted approach. I'm going to call on my mom because she's had her hand up multiple times. I'll get back to you, Emerson. Uh-huh.
When we're trying to be conscientious about sustainability choices or environment and so forth, I didn't know the impact of with all the various choices. So I would say, I try to be able to that a lot of other people don't. So the people that are coming to this restaurant, did they have any prior knowledge of
So from the customer interviews, many of the participants had some awareness that meat isn't that great for the environment, or they try to reduce beef consumption and those things, but they don't really know like the specifics necessarily.
So we have like a little blurb that describes some of this, the codes are, so people can understand.
Well, you called me out, Mom. It's been a long week and I haven't able to write this piece yet. So yeah, so I mean, I would at the very minimum, it would have the the breakdown of these icons and what it means, and say something to the effect that El Harissa cares about the impact that our business has on the environment and blah blah blah, heartfelt stuff. And but I would also like to link it to a QR code for more information and have it paired with, there's another, the returnable container pilot that they're doing. They have a little framed image with a QR code where they could learn more about the returnable container pilot. I feel like this has been a whole infomercial. Anyway, I gotta cut it off. Okay. Cool. Thanks, Mom. All right. Huh? All right. And after this infomercial, you can try the product.
Yes. Good job, Kendall.
Thank you.
Good job.
Did I do okay?
Good. Especially appreciate the cute baby pictures, not baby pictures.
Yeah,
toddler
like
pictures.
toddler.
Yes. It's very sweet.
Toddler picture.